gladiatorum. Okay, so I hope you can see my screen. I see it in my preview that I'm sharing the presentation, but I don't see the preview. But just scream if you cannot see it, then I can try to fix something. Without much further ado, today's topic is analogy, or to be precise, analogical change in your final exam, and we will have examples of the questions in the final exam from this part of the course next week. I will give you then the questions that can appear for analogy, and some questions also for sociological induced changes, so that we can do them together. They are, in some respects, they need a similar treatment. So what is analogy? Analogy is about assimilating differences. So if you are a sci fiction fan, then you know the next slide. If you're not, then I will explain. So there was a movie about in Star Trek universe where there's a hive-like entity of cyborgs, short Borg, and they assimilate everybody to live in their hive, where they have the queen, and the queen organizes and controls everybody like the bees, right? And from there, we have a very common expression in English: resistance is futile. You will be assimilated. If you haven't seen this film, I can recommend it. Of course, if you're sci-fi fiction fans, it's got 7.6 on Internet Movie Database. Not bad if you admit it, or you don't want to admit it, but it's a good rating. 7.1 from the critics, so very close. But the whole point is that this is actually what analogy is about. Usual analogy is about uh, assimilating things so that they are all the same. So on the one hand, you have a language change, some innovations pushed by either from above or from below, as we discussed yesterday, and not yesterday, last week, but new things in language. And then analogy tries to somehow level it, to make it all look logical, and that this innovation makes sense in the context of the whole language. So analogy that we're talking about here is not the analogy that you will find described in a dictionary, a comparison in which an idea or thing is compared to another things. So it tries to explain the idea or a thing by comparing it to something that is familiar. Metaphors, similes, they are the basis of analogy: as light as a feather, as dead as a doornail, as busy as a bee. These are all analogies, including, for example, sly like a fox or as sweet as sugar. But this actually is what analogy is about in a way, because you will see in analogy, if you have a group of words that behave like one, and then there's another group that behaves in a different way, but it's a much smaller group, analogy will try to make everything behave like one, so that there's always, you compare, let's say, something irregular with something that is regular. There's a big number of, let's say, regular things, very small number of irregular forms, and then you turn irregular forms into regular so that it all makes sense. That's why, for example, children, when they acquire language, instead of caught, they would say catched. Instead of women, they say woman's. And men's, of course, instead of man for plural. So this is actually an analogy. You try to apply the same set of rules everywhere. And that is what this is about. We call it analogical change. Traditionally, it was actually one of the three main types of language change. There was, according to those neo-grammarians, sound change, which we talked about, borrowing, which we will talk about next week, and there is analogy. Uh, and they hated analogy. Neo-grammarians, they didn't like analogy because it was not as strict as sound laws, and it was difficult to define for them, but even today it is difficult to define. But fundamentally, as I told you, it's the process when one form adjusts to resemble another. And those two forms have to be related. So two forms that are related, you choose one and you decide that this one should resemble another. And neo-grammarians didn't like it, and they gave us, some weird misconceptions because they treated everything that was not sound change or borrowing as analogy, but that's not true. If you hear people saying analogy is everything that is not sound change or borrowing, that's not true. Those are very old neo-grammarian notions. Analogy is exactly what I described to you, and it is sometimes called internal borrowing because you take patterns that exist in your language and you borrow them and apply them to other words that have different patterns but are related in meaning or grammatically. For example, you have irregular verbs, and some irregular verbs, as you probably know today, are becoming regular. So originally, for example, when I was your age, it was still more common to use lit as the past tense of light. These days, you can really hear lighted more often than lit. And I'm pretty sure that when you become my age, there will be very few people who will be using lit. And more irregular verbs are becoming regular, and that is actually an example of analogical change. If all verbs have this ed suffix, and there is just a small number of those that do not, they are all verbs, right? So they should follow the same rules. And that's what analogy does. It doesn't look at phonology, it looks at similar forms, so in meaning or morphology, so it depends on morphology, and it tries to apply the same pattern. So in other words, analogy, if you like sci-fi again, this is how I would actually describe analogy to myself, but you don't have to accept this analogy in a way. But analogy is like bringing the balance in the force. So there's the bright side, there's the dark side, there are regular patterns, there are irregular patterns. Language change and language innovation creates new patterns. These are not like most patterns. Analogy tries to make all things behave the same. So it's not actually favoring anybody, it just wants to retain the balance. So these are like two different sides of the same force in language. So one tries to maintain the system, the other tries to uh, create innovations in the system, and neither is more important. Together they make language evolve, because when one creates something, if it's a really good innovation, then analogy may apply this new innovation to everything else. That's how, for example, English lost its suffixes because they didn't make sense at one point historically, and English lost suffixes. So let me show you some other examples. This is from your book that you can find online or in the library, but of course for social distancing we are not supposed to go to the library. But the typical example is sorry, which is an adjective, and sorrow, which is a noun. So these two words, sorry and sorrow, were originally two distinct words. They were historically unrelated. So sorry comes from Old English sari, which means sore, pain, sensitive. You see, it's sar plus e, adjectival suffix, and this created sorry, but Old English it was sari. And sorrow comes from Old English sorg, which is grief, regret. And there are some sound changes that you don't need to, take into consideration. It would take too much of our time today. So the regular change from Old English a, such as a in sari, would create Middle English o and Modern English o. So that's, for example, how you got stone. So Old English had stan, Middle English stone, and this is how it's spelled even today. We discussed this. And then you got stone, which is the actual what do we call it? The great vowel shift. Yes. Sorry, I'm tired. I exchange emails with the platform that I don't want to talk about because it's being recorded, but that prevented uploads of videos because of copyright issues, but it was fixed. But the last email was exchanged at 3 a.m. So when it comes to sorry, you look at this same root vowel, long a, and you see that it followed a different pronunciation. You don't pronounce sorry today as sorry or sorry or something like that. You actually pronounce sorry as sorry. It's sorry, right? It's not sorry. And the reason for that is analogy. So most speakers of English assume that sorry and sorrow are somehow related. And then they noticed that one has a, the other has, you know, uh, or, and they decided, and this is actually where neo-grammarians really hate analogy. You never know which form will be the one that will be used as a model. So very likely we could have ended up with sorrow instead of sorrows, and then sorry would be sorry. We don't know, but for some reason native speakers at that point in time when this happened, and it was between Middle English and Modern English, decided that it should all be o. And that's how we got sorry and sorrow, not sorry. And that's analogy. So you have one form, you have one that has similar meaning and a very similar form and pronunciation, and you make them have the same, for example, root vowel. No sound change can explain this. No, this is simply like, this looks like that, it should behave like that, let's make it behave. That's analogy. And there are several types of analogy. So there is the so-called proportional four-part analogy, there is analogical leveling, and there is analogical extension. They are mostly in a way related, and they all follow more or less the same pattern. This that I told you, that there are two things, you make one behave on the model of the other, but there are some, let's say, peculiarities for each type. So the basic analogy, the one that was first, let's say, formulated, and this, by the way, applies also to language variation. This applies to all innovations in language. They are all subject to analogy. So analogy is a universal force in language. This is what tries to keep the balance in language between innovation and, let's say, no change at all. Analogy is in charge of the balance. So proportional analogy is based on the word which you probably hate, just as I hate it, because it's from mathematics, but it's based on an equation. So four-part analogy is when x is, let's say, the element that is supposed to change. So if a equals what a is to be, c should be 2x, or a is to b as c is to what. And as I already mentioned to you, one of the most famous examples of proportional analogy, four-part analogy, analogy in general, is the verbal paradigm. So sometimes analogy works by trying to, let's say, create regular verbs out of irregular, but sometimes analogy works within irregular verbs. So there are too many different patterns of irregular verbs. It doesn't make sense, you know. Analogy tries to make everything more or less uniform. So, you know, then in some dialects of English, you have the form of dive that is dove. And you know that this is the present day form, dive, dove, although you can hear also some people say dived. But if it's irregular, then it's dove. And the reason why it's dove, originally it wasn't, is that people tried to, the language community tried to make it look like one of the irregular patterns that they know. So ride, road, what should be dive? Well, it should be dove, because that's how you would treat road. Ride, road, dive, dove, that's analogy. So that's not the original form of the past tense of dive. It was duvan or something like that. But it changed to dove in the irregular form because of four-part analogy. And I have additional slides here that I can show you, but we can simply go through them. So in those dialects, as I mentioned, it's not treated as dived as a regular verb, but they thought that it should belong to the irregular verbs like drive, drove, write, wrote, or strive, strove. And then what they did was exactly this, what I told you. So they changed they changed dived to dove, although this is not the original Old English form of this past tense form. Another example is cow, and this is a much better example because you don't need to know a lot about Old English paradigm. So I will surprise you, but cows were not cows in plural originally. So cows were kine. It was spelled as kine. It was actually pronounced as kine, but at one point it must have been also pronounced as kine in the early modern English before it was completely changed through analogy. So if bull equals bulls in plural, then cow should be cows. Kine makes no sense. Although originally kine, but pronounced as keen or keen, was actually the correct form. So this is another famous example of four-part analogy. So, for example, if you get something like this in your final exam, and you're supposed to, let's say, let's say that the question is provide an example of a proportional analogy. So the best example would be cows, because it's very simple to describe. So you can say Old English, and I actually have that inside the slide. I have explanation here. So the Old English word for cow was Kuh. If you speak German, that's Kuh. That's still today in German, it's Kuh, spelled as Kuch, K-U-H. And then, just like Moose, Miss, it changed to Kühn. And then Kühn, and then probably Kine, but then because of the analogy with bull bulls, it became cow cows. So it is no longer in irregular form today, it is a regular form, and this is what analogy does. So at this point I may stop and I keep talking, and this is not very interactive, but let me ask you if this is what something you already did in variation, because this also applies to variation. So if there are like patterns in a particular variety or dialect, that usually happens through analogy, but to some local forms, and that's how varieties start diverging from, let's say, the received pronunciation or the dominant dialect. But if you didn't do it, then I will provide additional details. But if you already know this, I can actually rush through some of the slides. So I don't want to kind of, tell you something that you already know, because I was a student a long time ago, and when I was a student I didn't have a course in language varieties, so I never I have to assume whether you did something or not. Well, since you're silent, I think that you didn't do it in language varieties, and then I will show you another type of analogy. So as I mentioned, there are three types of analogical change: proportional analogy, leveling, and extension. I just showed you proportional analogy, and in the slides you have additional examples, but because of time limitations, I don't want to spend too much time on too many examples. I think that dive, dove, and cow, kine becoming cow, cows, that these are actually very illustrative for proportional analogy. So I will now move to this other type, and that's analogical leveling. Analogical leveling are, let's say, subtypes of proportional analogy. So this is all based on Campbell's book, which you can find on the website, the relevant sections of it, in obligatory reading links. But fundamentally, what most linguists agree, historical and historical sociolinguists, etc., is that proportional analogy is actually the underpinning of analogical leveling. So it's just a special instance of the other way around, sorry. Many of the proportional analogical changes are instances of analogical leveling. So what we mean by analogical leveling is not how it came to be. Is it like A to B is what C is to X? What we care about is the result. So when we talk about analogical leveling, we are talking about changes that make language more uniform. So this can refer to morphology, to allomorphs, allophones, whatever. So here, this is from Campbell's book, analogical leveling renders the number of allomorphs. So this is primarily about morphology, as we said, but it could apply to phonology, but not often. So it makes paradigms more uniform. So this is another thing that I mentioned to you. So this is how in some dialects throw through thrown, which is a typical irregular verb, it becomes throw, throwed, throwed. Cleave, clove, cloven becomes cleaved, cleaved. Strive, strove, striven becomes strive, strive, strived. So analogical leveling creates regularity. That's the whole point, makes the paradigms uniform. This doesn't have to be actually regular versus irregular. It can also be, as we saw with proportional analogy, and as we said, analogical leveling can be proportional analogy. It's just about the effect that it has. So if proportional analogy creates a more uniform paradigm, so we lose exceptions, we have only regular patterns, then it's leveling. So that, for example, is this change which makes most irregular verbs more and more similar to one another. So that's, for example, what gives you okay, the present day of bear, bore, born. So originally it was bear, bar, born, but just like break, broke, broken, this becomes break, bear, bore, born, break, broke, broken. So they all start looking the same. So the stem vowels of the past tense were leveled, as it says here, or actually doesn't say here, but so a and o were became identical. Why? So that it makes sense. You could say, like, in this kind of verb, it's not a and o, it's simply o. So all the stem vowels of the past tense became exactly like the stem vowels of the participle. So as you can see, it can be not, let's say, morphological, it can be phonological as well. So that's one example of analogical leveling. And I can also give you some other examples. For example, comparative and superlative forms. This is another famous example. It's listed in Campbell's book, but it's not the only one. But for example, most students, when they are asked in the written exam, provide an example of analogical leveling, they usually go for older and oldest. Older and oldest are not the original forms of the old paradigm. So originally, old had elder and eldest as the comparative and superlative forms. And at some points in time, old, elder, eldest, and old, older, oldest coexisted happily. So this is actually what we did in sound changes. So the Old English eld adjective, which is today Old English diphthongs were monophthongized. So this Old English eld became more modern English old. You had the suffix era, which you added to eld. So the superlative and the comparative had e mutation. So it was old, eldra, and eldest. That's the present day older and oldest. But these effects of e mutation have been leveled out because this was a very common adjective. Even today, it's one of the most common words in English among top 300, according to Oxford. So it made no sense for a very common adjective that actually has comparatives. It's not like it's irregular adjective that changes its, form completely. Uh, it made no sense for it to be irregular. So it was leveled to new forms that are regular. So old became, right, like the base form, and then you said elder, eldest, and then you simply change it to older, oldest. So we say that these forms were leveled out. Of course, what we know from history of English is that when you do this, there are two outcomes. You can either retain these original forms, but with a different meaning, or you can discard them completely and they are lost and they are no longer used. In this case, we actually do use elder, eldest in the archaic, religious, and archaic and religious contexts. Also sometimes when describing family relations within, royalty and etc. So the old forms were retained, but in a completely specialized meaning, whereas new forms became the dominant forms. Okay, so another example of analogical leveling we can that I can give you is also near. So near, Old English was near. Uh, the comparative and superlative were neara and nearsta. So that was actually a regular paradigm in Old English because of the era and ist suffix and the sound changes in Old English. So neach, neara, nechsta. Sound changes that happen between Old English and modern English and Middle English in between changed these forms to what you now know as nigh, near, and next. But would you today say that the comparative of near is next, and or the superlative of near is next? So what happened is that near got regular forms near in the 16th century, and the nearest a bit later, that substituted next. So near, nearer, nearest are analogical levelings. So irregular forms were completely eradicated, and nigh and the next are retained, but in a completely specialized meaning. They have very limited and very shifted meanings. They are no longer general words for near. Nigh is when you say, of course, the end is nigh. Again, religious, you see, old forms are usually retained in religious context, whereas next became a function word. Fundamentally, it's a determiner, quantifier to be precise. And the final analogical leveling example can be, for example, late, later, latest. So in Old English, it was lat, letra, and latost. This was actually, this should have produced uh, lat, later, and last as the regular, normal, or modern English renditions of these forms. But this is, of course, as you know, not what we have. We have late, later, latest. We don't say late, later, last. So this latter was retained, but we know it from the former and the latter. And of course, last was replaced with latest, but last again is retained in a completely specialized meaning. So this is what we mean by analogical leveling. Today, you would say that both near and late are completely regular in their paradigms, but they were never regular to start with. What made them regular is this analogical leveling, which made the forms completely regular in terms of paradigm, but the irregular forms were retained with specialized meaning. So it took me a lot of time to find a nice image to actually show a summary of this, but we can say that proportional analogy is often at the root of leveling. It's just that when we say that something is leveling, it means that four-part analogy led to a paradigm that is uniform. So if you are different, like this yellow smiley among all these sad smileys, what analogy does, it forces you to become blue. But you don't have to be blue in the sense of sad. You can still be happy, but at least you have to be blue. So that's actually analogical leveling. Uh, when you look at the big picture, it should all be blue, like here. So you should have all, let's say, more or less identical patterns. Historically, you can find explanations for them, but the paradigm, when you look at it as a big picture, has to be uniform. So that's analogical leveling. And there's only one other type of analogical change that is still remaining. So you remember the basic type of analogy is proportional analogy. What if A is to B, then C is something to what? So you have to create a new form based on this A to B is C to X. And if we end up with a uniform paradigm, we have leveling. Then you can actually guess what extension is. And a logical extension is kind of the opposite of leveling, but not really the opposite. It's just, let's say, a point of view. And a logical extension is when you don't necessarily create a new paradigm that is completely uniform. You actually use existing alteration and you extend it to some forms which didn't originally have those alterations. So that's, for example, when you change the weak verb into a strong verb. This is what I showed you as an example of proportional analogy, but that's actually an analogical extension. You have a regular verb, dive, dived, and then because it looks like ride, rode, you decide in some dialects that it should be dive, dove. And then we call it analogical extension. This is completely, something that is ongoing in English in terms of dive. You can hear some dialects of English or varieties using dived, some dialects using dove, but in the history of English, actually, there were other examples of a completely finalized change, where, for example, war was originally a regular verb. It's past tense and past participle verb verede. So it had the dental suffix d, ed today. So, but it became a strong verb because of analogical extension. And analogical extension also, some other examples are also from non-standard past tense. So in some dialects, arrive has the past tense arove, and squeeze has the past tense of squoze. Uh, and that's actually the overview of analogical changes. So fundamentally, you always have proportional analogy, but based on what it does, you can label it as leveling or extension. Leveling is what makes the paradigms uniform. Extension is what creates, which takes a small alteration and extends this to a bigger number of items. Ultimately, extension can lead to leveling, but not necessarily. So what's the difference? Let's go back to analogical, to neo-grammarians who hated analogy. Let's compare analogy to sound change, or not compare it, but let's just look at them in parallel. So there's something called Sturtevant's paradox. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly because I only read books about it and I couldn't find the proper pronunciation. So, but what it does, it says that, sorry, my keyboard got stuck. Sturtevant's paradox says that sound change is regular, but causes irregularity. You remember, mouse becomes mice because of immutation. Analogy is irregular. You never know when it's going to happen. You never know what will be the model for analogy. But actually, this irregular analogy causes regularity. So analogy, in other words, eliminates alterations caused by sound changes. This is what I told you about. So this is what is known as Tertuvant's paradox, but it could be a different pronunciation of this surname. And this is the yin and yang of language change. You create irregularity, but analogy, which is irregular, tries to make things regular. Completely paradoxical, but this is, let's say, the foundation of language change. And you can use all those examples that I gave you, but I prepared one additional example that's based on the example of another noun with e mutation. So originally you had brodor and breder, but brodor and breder were actually irregular forms from the point of view of modern English or Middle English. So they were changed to brother brothers. And what would be A and B for brother brothers? Of course, it would be, let's say, father fathers or sister sisters. So this brother brother, like it was actually regular sound change. Analogical change is irregular, but it created regular forms of brother brothers, and this is the whole thing. What neo-grammarians hated was that actually you could, it didn't happen to mouse, mice, and foot, feet. Why? Nobody knows. Why did brother brothers become regular, but mouse mouses and foot foots didn't become regular? Nobody knows. That's why we say that analogy is irregular. It happens irregularly. You never know when it's going to happen. But when it happens, it creates a regular pattern. It eliminates irregularity. That's an example of what I had in mind when I presented you this Sturtevant's paradox. There are other examples of this, but then let me give you a summary. So analogical change generally targets paradigms which show alteration caused by phonological changes, sound changes, innovations in that respect. But in most cases, what analogy does is it reduces the number of alterations, so you have a level, uniform paradigm, or you extend those alterations to a bigger number of items, which ultimately again leads to more regularity. And analogy, according to virtually all linguists, is the basis for many other types of change, which you know from other courses, but are actually in all historical linguistics books and also books that deal with language change that is caused by social factors. This is always listed as an analogical change. So you may have heard about the next slides in a number of different courses that you had, but originally this all comes from historical analysis of analogical changes. So but before we get there, we have to also mention analogical models. So I will give you other types of analogies, but before that, a short info on immediate and non-immediate analogical models. So what do I mean by that? This distinction, this is also something that often pops up in the written exam. Provide an example of immediate and non-immediate analogical model and explain the models. So you would say that immediate and non-immediate model, analogical model, is the difference between two types of analogical change depending on the place in the language where you find the relation of symmetry or similarity. So this distinction is based on changes that happen within the paradigm and within the same speech context. So analogical changes that happen within paradigm are called non-immediate, and the same speech context changes are called immediate. That may sound illogical. Why would the same speech context be immediate and within paradigm non-immediate? Shouldn't it be the other way around? Well, it's not the other way around, because when you think about it, unless you're a linguist, you never produce the whole paradigm. You never find yourself in a real life situation where you say, catch, catches, caught, catching, caught. Or, you say be, am, are, is, was, were, been, being, been. And you produce the whole paradigm of a verb. What happens in real life is that you use words in a particular context. You never, as a regular user of language, as a normal non-linguist speaker, you don't think of paradigms. You simply use your native tongue. So in everyday life and in historical linguistics and social induced changes, it is the immediate model that usually happens most frequently. So that's when you use two forms in the same discourse situation, in the same context, and then analogy occurs. Let's say, non-immediate model analogical change is very rare, because it is very rare that you list the whole paradigm. Let me show you what we mean by immediate model. So originally, January was not pronounced or as February. It was like February, right? The reason why we pronounced January and February more in a way that now they are almost identical in the pattern is this immediate model of analogical change. January and February are found in the same context when you talk about first 2 months, the winter months, etc. You often mention, we could do it in January, or then originally you would say February, but then you ended up with February. So that's actually the immediate model. And they're also within the same, let's say, you can see it also in the calendar, they're next to each other. Another more famous example, it took me some time to find a nice example from English. The most famous example of the immediate model comes from Spanish days of the week. If you speak Spanish, I don't, by the way, but I read books on this, so I took this from a book. So correct me if I'm wrong, if you speak Spanish. All Spanish days of the week end in S today. Lunes, martes, miércoles, jueves, viernes, whatever. I'm probably mispronouncing it. However, if you know a little bit about history of the Spanish language, then you find out that the S suffix is the genitive suffix, and it only appeared on certain types of nouns. So originally, what you know as jueves, I guess the pronunciation is, was originally in Latin dies Jovis, the day of Jupiter. So it had this suffix s. What you know as viernes or viernes was originally dies Veneris, the day of the goddess Venus. So Veneris gave you viernes. However, this was not true for lunes. Originally, this was dies lune. The suffix in Latin was e, so it was a moon's day. But because we use all these days in the same context, we constantly talk about days of the week. Every day we mention these words many times throughout the day, usually next to each other. Shall we meet on Monday or maybe Tuesday? How about Wednesday? So that's why you got lunes. The same thing happened to dies Mercury, which I guess gave you Spanish miércoles or miércoles. I'm not sure. But the main point was that in Latin and Proto, let's say Spanish in a way, it was E. The suffix was E, but it became S again because of the majority of other days in the paradigm. So this S was introduced under no analogy with other days of the week. The same thing happened to some numbers in Germanic. In particular, we should look at numbers 4 and 5. So Proto-Germanic 4 was queter. So not actually Proto-Germanic, it was Proto-Indo-European. It was queter. This is the reconstructed form. And Proto-Indo-European 5 was penk or penque, I think. Yeah, penque 5. Now, as you know, from regular changes that we talked about in Germanic, Indo-European kv should become hv, spelled as WH these days. And Indo-European P should become F, right? So do we say today hwor? We don't say hwor, we say four. There's no hv when you pronounce the number 4. The reason that we have 4 today, the reason why we deviated from the original hv sound, is that for some reason native speakers decide that in this immediate model of sound change, 4 should sound like 5. And that's how we got 4. Originally, it should have been hwor. Or maybe the problem was with another word that sounded similar. But there are also in the slides examples from Greek dialects, etc. But we don't have to go through all of them. They're just different examples of this immediate model from Greek. I would just like to show you another example from English. So in English, the word female, nobody would, say that this should be pronounced any other way except female. But if you look at this, spelling, you may actually look up this word in historical dictionaries and find out that its original form, when it was first borrowed in English, was femelle. So it was femelle. It was completely different pronunciation. We know that this was the pronunciation because it was used in some poems and it was used to form the rhyme. So femelle. The reason why we don't pronounce it as femelle today is the immediate model, because male and female are frequently uttered together. And this femelle changed to more similar pattern of male because it also looked like female contained male in it. But that was not true. Originally, there was never a male in female. It was a completely different word taken from French, femelle. So that's another immediate model. And For non-immediate model, there are almost no examples because it's extremely rare, because this doesn't usually happen in a paradigm. For non-immediate model, you can give examples that I gave you for leveling, like older, oldest. That's actually the same paradigm. Near, near, nearest. Completely different from nigh, near, next, which was original. And these examples within the changes of the adjectival paradigm are actually good examples of the non-immediate model, because this was analogy happening within the paradigm. And as I promised, there are other types of analogy, things that you know from some other courses, but are actually all based on analogy. So the most famous of them, and the one that is first listed is Campbell's book, is hypercorrection. So I'm pretty sure that some of you had encountered this concept of hypercorrection in some other courses. So is anybody willing to share a definition, explanation, what is hypercorrection? Or you're too tired to unmute yourselves? Or maybe there's nobody there. I didn't look at the attendee list. Oh, you are there. Anybody? Hypercorrection? Okay, if you're not in the mood for discussion, or you didn't encounter this in previous courses, hypercorrection is when you correct things which are already correct. You think that you are correcting something, but you're actually just creating a wrong form. So that's hypercorrection. So it's analogical change, but also socially induced change. So hypercorrection usually happens when you have speakers of a low ranking dialect or a variety of a language, and those speakers are aware that maybe their variety is not particularly respected. So those speakers, because they know that they speak, let's say, a form of language that is frowned upon by educated people. Think about, I don't know, white trash rednecks in some Rust Belt states in the United States. So when they want to speak proper American English, let's say, they attempt to change forms that they think would sound acceptable in the standard variety. So they try to conform their irregular substandard dialect with the standard dialect or standard variety. Sometimes they succeed, but most often they overshoot. They try too hard and they create wrong outcomes. And this sounds funny. People then laugh even more because of how they speak. But that's actually just one example of what we discussed last week, socially induced language change. People are constantly aware, although some do not want to admit it, but they are constantly aware of whether they speak the standard, prestigious, or substandard, not prestigious dialect of a language. And depending on the context, they will try to change how they speak in order to match the expectations of the audience. That's called audience design, by the way. You always address a particular audience. When you see a baby, you don't say, "What a wonderful baby you are." That's what I say to you, oh baby. Saying, "You're so cuddly and cute." So audience design means that these people, when in contact with people who speak prestigious standard dialects, will try to match their expectations that everybody should speak standard dialects. So the best example of hypercorrection comes from a Western US dialect. So when you look at the map of let's say US dialects, Western dialects are marked in this, or let's say brown color. And one of the main features of the Western US dialect is that D is not pronounced after N. So if you tell your son to clean the sand, if you're a Western US speaker, you will say "Son, clean the sand." You don't say sand, you say sand. And you say like, please, you don't say please usually, probably in those dialects, you say, find me a gun. Not find me a gun, you say fine. So without this "d" at the end. Another example is therefore find. And another example is, let's have a round of beer. Not a round of beer, but a round of beer. So you see, in all these dialects, you don't pronounce the final "d." You say "san" instead of "sand." You say "fine" instead of "find." You say "round" instead of "round." And some speakers from Western dialects, when they are in a situation that they are aware that they speak a substandard dialect, and they apply this analogical change, always do X, never do Y, those prescriptive rules, like, you should not speak like that, they try to undo the effects of the loss of final "d." So they insert "d" when they try really hard to speak proper English. They insert "d" even after every final "n", even those "n" sounds which were never followed by "d". So this leads to some hilarious pronunciations in formal context. So this is based on field linguistic research, where they ask people to pronounce, pairs of words. And then these Western dialect speakers would, instead of lawn, they would pronounce lawn as lawned. And then a pawn shop ended up being a pawned shop. When somebody was about to drown, they would say the person was about to be drowned. And the past tense of that was drowned. So they would insert "d" even after "n" in derived forms. So this is a perfect example of hypercorrection. And you see why it's an analogical change, because I lose "the" when there is "n" preceding it. So I should include "the" whenever I end my word with "n", even when originally there was no "the" in that position. So that's hypercorrection is, and virtually all examples of hypercorrection are very good examples of proportional analogy as the general type of analogy. Another famous example of hypercorrection is the nominative and accusative case of the pronoun I versus me. So many speakers in coordination, when the second conjunct is a pronoun, they know that they should use the accusative case, but only in some contexts, right? So we are all instructed that we should not do that in the subject position. So the accusative case is only for the object position. So that's why you should say John and I are good friends, not like John and me are good friends. John and she are now together. John and her are now together. So we are all, we are constantly exposed to this pattern that we should always use the nominative form, right? But what happens is that because we are instructed that it's wrong to say John and me, we people, not we necessarily, but many even native speakers try to hypercorrect. And even in the object position, when you should have the accusative case, they start using the nominative case. So that's why you get sentences from native speakers that read like, he likes John and I. So this, of course, should be he likes John and me, because this is the object, this is the accusative case. You have examples from native speakers, he made it for you and I, instead of he made it for you and me, or Maggie gave it to Carrie and I, instead of Mary gave it to Carrie and me. It gets even worse. Some native speakers add suffixes to the pronoun, genitive suffixes, not realizing that these forms are already case marked. So Mary and I's friends are here. So hypercorrection is about prescriptive grammar in many cases. And in most instances, in English at least, which doesn't have a book of writing rules, it doesn't have pravopis as Serbian does or German does. So in English, at least, these prescriptive grammar rules fail terribly, because if something like a rule is not part of the native speaker competence and it's enforced, it can produce terrible results. So hypercorrection is very often used in the final exam, and a very common question in the final exam is, what is hypercorrection? Provide an example. So what you can do is say hypercorrection is a subtype of analogical change, which is also related to social induced language changes. It's about speakers of a particular language and a dialect that is socially lower in the hierarchy than regular, let's say, standard dialects. When those speakers try to correct forms which are already correct because they want to fit their language to the standard variety, and they overshoot and produce wrong results. And then you give example of Western dialects like loaned and pawned shop and drowned, or you give example of John saw you and I. That's the most, or John saw Mary and I. So these are let's say possible questions for hypercorrection. Another form of analogy is something that again you may know. That's called folk etymology. It has nothing to do with folk music, but I'm pretty sure you dealt with this in morphology courses at least. So this is about regular people, non-linguists, find meaningful associations in forms where there were no such associations to begin with. So they create new associations, they create new forms based on their layman understanding of what are the components of the word. The most famous example, I'm pretty sure that you know this, is about a very famous fast food dish. Do you know what I'm talking about? Anybody? Folk etymology created actually a combinatory suffix as a result. It has to do with the German town. Exactly. Hamburger. So hamburger was originally something from from Hamburg, sorry. Hamburger was originally just a product, something from Hamburg. But for some reason, English native speakers in America in particular reanalyze it as ham plus burger. And then this burger somehow is, I guess, a bun or something like that. Uh, so the word associated with ham was, ham in hamburger got associated with ham. And you created a new word boundary, and you got this burger, which is now morphologically uh, completely independent. Another good example of folk etymology is vagabundo. In Latin, it means vagus, wandering, undecided, and bundus, which is a gerund suffix, so it is like a wandering entity. In Spanish, this vagabundo was completely non-transparent. So for Spanish native speakers, this bundo seemed like a mispronunciation of something that made more sense, and that's vagamundo, somebody who wanders the world. So bundo is no longer, like a good suffix in Spanish. It was a suffix only in Latin. So this created a new semantic suffix, or actually a combinatory form. So you ended up with vagamundo. Another famous example is outrage. Outrage. The word outrage uh, comes from, let's say, a very old French form of outrage. I guess this is how it's pronounced. Outrage. And this outrage was fundamentally Latin ultra, meaning beyond, and the suffix for creating a noun, which is agium. So this outrage. So there was never rage there, and there was never out there originally. But since outrage was very frequently used by nobility, ordinary people who heard it pronounced tried to make sense out of it. So through also semantic change, we got the present day form of outrage. So there was also, in this case, over several centuries, 8 centuries to be precise, there were also sound changes, but it was shaped so that it got some meaning in English. So you think of outrage as out and rage, but that was never there. It was outrage. So the present day form of out and rage is completely the result of folk etymology. So it's an act of extreme violence today. So there was also some semantic change. Then another famous example is harebrained. Harebrained is originally having a brain like a hare, like a bunny. Bunnies allegedly are stupid. Uh, but for some reason, we think that it's, in some way, we now think that being stupid is having a brain with hair. I don't know how this developed, but that's actually folk etymology. Another example of analogical change, so it's not only hypercorrection, it's not only folk etymology, there's also back formation. Back formation is similar to folk etymology, but it happens with native words. So folk etymology usually happens with borrowed loan words. Back formation happens when you misinterpret what is originally a word, but heavily changed or developed word in your own mother tongue. One of the, let's say, can happen also for borrowings. I'm not saying, but whereas folk etymology is usually associated with borrowed words, although harebrained is original English word, uh, it's more commonly visible in borrowings. Back formation is visible in some borrowings, but also in native words. So let me show you some examples. So very commonly, back formation involves misinterpretation of the suffix. So cherry today stems from French caris. Uh, so this was thought to be the suffix for plural. So they thought that caris meant cherries. So you take s off and you end up with a single cherry. What they didn't know is that caris actually is singular. So s is not the plural there. So this is back formation again in borrowing. But you know that French was used parallel to English, so there was constant code switching. Another example of that is P. That's actually originally English word. So in Old English, P was peas, but peas was actually singular. Pisan was plural, like child, children. This pisan is the same pattern that gave us children or oxen today. Uh, However, because of this pisa and this e was silent eventually, so they thought that peas is the plural of p, and that's how you got p, because s was misinterpreted as a plural suffix. So as I mentioned, it was Pisan in Old English plural. And for example, r or r was sometimes interpreted as a nominalizing suffix, where it was never a nominalizing suffix. So to burgle, we have it as a verb, sorry, derived from burglar. But burglar was simply borrowed. It had no suffix. It was not a suffix for nominalizing. It was just a borrowing, but it gave us to burgle. Now I have some additional examples, but since we also have to do a little bit of practice, I will skip to meta-analysis as the last of these hypercorrection examples. Meta-analysis is very similar to what we just talked about. So back formation, meta-analysis is a new form of looking at the same structure of the word, but in a different way. So the best example of meta-analysis, and it is in a way subtype of back formation, is reinterpretation of the sound n at the part at the beginning of a noun as indefinite article, but it was actually not an indefinite article. So the word adder today, like in black adder, in Old English was the word nadre. So nadre was a normal word in English, Old English. It had nothing to do with an article. Then in late Middle English, when the article, the indefinite article was more and more used, the Old English didn't have articles. They are a Middle English development. So this nadre was pronounced as a nadre, right? You had something like a nadre. And then when you try to pronounce it, and you pronounce it in a rapid succession, anadre sounds like an adder, right? Anadre, 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 an adder, and that gave you the adder. The same thing happened to other words, so like Old English navugar, which is the present day uh, auger, I think. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. And what also was changed through meta-analysis, which is kind of back formation, but not exactly the same. For example, Middle English napron, which is a diminutive of nape, tablecloth, became apron for the same reason. A napron, an apron, right? Becomes so when you speak rapidly, it's not clear whether it's an apron or an apron. But it didn't happen to napkin. Napkin stayed the same. So this is what people like neo-grammarians hate about all forms of analogical change, and that's that they are unpredictable. Why did napron become apron? Why did nader become adder? But nape and napkin, they became they didn't become ape and apekin. So they both meant a small tablecloth, but they had a completely different development because analogical change is completely unpredictable. And the last, actually, I forgot about it. The last type of analogical change, according to Campbell, but this is where I don't agree entirely with Campbell, who is the author of the book on historical linguistics that you have in the syllabus as the required reading, is that he also treats blending as analogy. I'm not sure that this is truly the case, but you know what blending is. Breakfast and lunch gives you brunch, camera and recorder gives you camcorder, information and commercial gives you infomercial. So let's treat blending as probably not a type of analogy. So let's make a summary. So immediate analogical model is analogical change which happens in the same speech context, January, February. 4 and 5, although originally it should have been chwor and 5. Then you also have, I didn't show you the slide. There's also the non-immediate model, which happens within the paradigm. In real life, this is not very frequent, but in English, we had many examples. The best ones are those from the verbal paradigm. And those are, of course, examples where either irregular verbs of one pattern become irregular verbs of a different pattern. So ride, sorry, bear, bare, born becomes bear, bore, born, or similar patterns, or the paradigm of the adjectives. That's actually the non-immediate analogical model. So old, eldra, eldest, which was the original form, becomes old, older, oldest. Neach, near, next, you change to near, nearer, nearest. And also, of course, later, latest, where latter and last, which is the original comparative and the superlative forms, they get completely different meanings. Other types of analogical change include hypercorrection, when you correct something that is already correct because you are of a lower social status and you want to accommodate your language to fit the expectations of somebody of a higher status. Folk etymology, back formation, meta-analysis, and I put here blending, but let's treat it with a little bit of caution. So, for the first time, I managed to finish the lecture at 7:30 almost. It's 7:29. So, my question now is, do you want a 5-minute break or you want to step into the exercises?
5 minute break, please.
Yay, that's what I hoped for too. I slept from 3 to 7. I'm dying in a way. So 5-minute break it is. I'll mute my mic and we'll talk to each other at 7:35 or 36, give or take. Time is relative. Grab a cup of coffee, tea, whatever. Talk to you soon. Okay, so it's 7:35. I am back. I hope you are also back because we can start the exercises. And here, I know that we are all tired. You all, or I know that most of you also work. I hear that some of you are, working even. I know at MA courses that some people are working even two jobs. Uh, and so we are very busy, very tired, but we have only, let's say, like 40 minutes of exercises remaining, even fewer than that, depends on how it goes. This is an exercise that I often use to, let's say, formulate questions in the written exam on analogy. So instead of sometimes asking like what is the immediate and what is the non-immediate analogical model, provide an example for each, uh, I could ask something completely along those lines related to analogy, but where I ask you to identify the type of analogical change based on these exercises we are now about to start. So, for example, you can get exactly this question. In some dialects of English, the pattern bring, brought, brought has become bring, brang, brung. And of course, you know that bring, brought, brought is the original pattern used throughout English uh, varieties. What would you consider this? Which kind of analogical change? You remember you have analogical extension and analogical leveling. You can always say that it's proportionate analogy, but fundamentally every analogical change is analogical proportional analogy. It's about whether you are reducing the number of different forms in the paradigm, you're reducing the number of irregularities, or you're extending a new pattern to more and more words. That would be extension. So just because this is not a new pattern and you're not extending this, you could say that this is analogical leveling. And I also happen to have a key provided with the teacher's copy of the book. But the reason why this would be called analogical leveling is that the number of different forms of irregular verbs is being reduced this way. So instead of having a pattern X ought, you have like sing, sang, sang, and this pattern, which is actually older and seems like a more typical irregular pattern than bring, brought, brought. So what would you write in the final exam if you got a question in some dialects of English, the pattern bring, brought, brought has become bring, brang, brung? Why is the question that I would simply add there. So you would say this represents an example of analogical leveling because the irregular pattern bring, brought, brought is leveled to a more irregular and more common irregular pattern similar to sing, sang, sung, and that produce bring, brang, brung. Okay, now somebody can provide the answer why standard English drag, dragged in some varieties have drag, drug. And here, so that you can make a right determination, Campbell mentions in the exercise, it appears in this case that the standard English pattern is older. So drag, dragged was always a regular verb. It was never an irregular verb. So drag, drug is what? Huh? I guess you are tired still. So this is actually analogical extension because you have a general pattern which is regular, but then you extend the irregular pattern, which is very small in number, to something that is already regular. So you're chunking away at. Sorry, something happened. Something happened. Something happened. Um, I have to admit somebody. Yeah. So that's an analogical extension. Why? You have a small alteration of irregular verbs, and I cannot think of really a pattern that is like drag. But that's like sing, sang, sung. I guess it's similar to sing, sang, sung. So this alteration, which is small and it's not the dominant one, is extended to something that is already, let's say, regular. So you're extending an alteration, not the dominant pattern. If you're extending the dominant pattern, then it's leveling. You are extending an alteration to a bigger number of items than it was originally there. Then, according to Campbell, since this is like a course in historical linguistics, we should also include some examples from languages that are not English, although I do it very often in a reluctant way. So here the question is Old Spanish siniestro, left, change from Latin sinister on the left to take on the IE under the influence of the antonym diestro, right? Since diestro and siniestro frequently occur together. So this is neither. So I will ask you, how would you describe this change? So this is not really about extension, and it's not about leveling. This is about the
model.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. This is the immediate model because they occur together. So that's exactly two forms occur in the same speech context, and that's why one of them is chosen to be a model for the other. This is called the immediate model. So in the written exam, you would say, uh, because the two forms occur in the same speech context and one changes its form based on the form of the other, this is an immediate analogical model that is the change in the same speech context. Another example from Campbell's book, and here, of course, you can have all those analogical changes that I talked to you about. And so everything from the previous slide comes here as a possible answer. So in many Spanish dialects, an intervocalic d is regularly lost, as in mercado becomes mercal, market. In some instances, however, there are changes of the following sorts. In dialect, you have balcado, but the standard is, sorry, bacalado, but the standard is bacalao. You also have in dialect Bilbado, but the standard is Bilbao. So in the final exam, there would be, of course, another question added after this full stop, and that would be explain the phenomenon. So what would you call it? So Bilbao is actually the name. Why would they add the in?
Hypercorrection.
Yes. And how would you then form your answer in the final exam?
Because in other words with similar phonemes, usually letter D would would be in that position, they would try to simply insert it to sound more standard.
Exactly. You have to mention that they want to sound more standard. And of course, the first thing that you mention in your answer is the first thing that you mentioned. This is an example of hypercorrection. And then you provide a sentence or two with this explanation. Great. Although it's 7:45, we are capable of doing this. So hypercorrection, this is hypercorrection. Of course, in these slides that I will also upload to the website, you will have only the correct answer. So there will be always, this is an animation, but I will make it appear immediately in PDF. So you will have a normal PDF where it's already written that it's hypercorrection. You have to just provide this, let's say, additional sentence or two where you give some, explanation of what was happening. Then another example from Campbell's book is this. In the Dominican Republic, forms such as the standard Spanish atras, behind, becomes astras. In this variety of Spanish, preconsonantal S or S is often lost. So original Spanish hasta, spelled as hasta, becomes ata. You lose S. The preconsonantal S is lost. So what could this be?
Maybe maybe back formation.
Back formation, or could be again what you just mentioned earlier, hypercorrection, because the key terms here are Dominican Republic. So it's not the standard variety. In the standard variety, so you have atras, but in these dialects, you have astras. So they think that they should remove, they think that they should actually, that they are mimicking the standard dialect, but they are actually just making it worse. Of course, in the final exam, I will always try to give examples that are not Spanish, at least those examples that you have to identify. You can always use examples from Spanish for your own purposes. But now this is my favorite question. I love it. And I actually, had some giggles when I read it for the first time 5 or 6 years ago in the book. So English, Jerusalem artichoke, which is a kind of sunflower with some similarities to an artichoke, is in origin from Italian girasole artichoco, where Italian girasole contains gira, turn around, and sole, sun, and artichoco is artichoke, which has nothing to do with Jerusalem, right? So how come that we have Jerusalem artichoke?
Folk etymology.
Yes, exactly. Girasol doesn't mean anything, but it sounds kind of like Jerusalem, right? Like mispronounced Jerusalem. And this is exactly folk etymology. So in the written exam, you would say this is an example of folk etymology. Always in your written exam, try. So not only in mine, I think this is a general guideline. So whenever you have a question, explain what happened, explain why. You say this is an example of folk etymology. Native speakers of English thought that girasol was a mispronounced or Italian pronunciation of the noun Jerusalem, or a place named Jerusalem, because girasol as an original compound in Italian was completely not transparent to native speakers. So they simply applied their folk etymology. Leave out this part, they applied folk etymology. You already mentioned it. Another great example of a kind of analogical change is coming from Florida. In English, Key West comes from the Spanish name Cabo Hueso, where Cayo is a key, actually related to key, and hueso, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, is a bone. So Cayo Hueso means a bone-shaped key, bone-shaped small island. So how come that Cayo Hueso gave us Key West? Huh? It's again folk etymology, because Cayo Hueso sounds like Cayo Vezo, right? And Cayo Vezo makes no sense, but Key West makes sense. So you would write this, and this is an example of folk etymology. The Spanish pronunciation of Cayo Vezo sounded a lot like Key West, which made sense to native speakers of English, unlike the original pronunciation that was completely non-transparent, and this led to Cayo Vezo becoming Key West. Okay, so now in Campbell's book, there are also like these examples, but as I mentioned, that this is not probably considered an example of analogy. You will not have it in the midterm, but of course, helicopter pros airport, heliport, snappy and jazzy, snazzy, jump and tumble, jumble. Of course, these are examples of, you know it from other courses,
Blending.
blending, yes. But as I said, we will not really use this in the written exam. What we can use in the written exam as an example where you have to provide an answer. So colloquial and regional variety of Spanish have aiga, I guess it's pronounced as aiga, where standard Spanish has waya, I'm not sure how I should pronounce it, which means there may be, subjunctive, and vaiga, where standard Spanish was vaya, like vaya con Dios, may go, subjunctive may go. These have been influenced by standard Spanish verb forms such as traiga, subjunctive of traer, and caiga, subjunctive of caer, to fail, to fall, or may fall. And this is obviously about this g, right? So original Spanish has forms like traiga and caiga, which,
Correction.
yes, analogical extension. So
Can
this,
we always assume it's hypercorrection? Correction.
no. Sorry. I thought you heard analogical extension, which sounds a lot like hypercorrection, right? So it's not hypercorrection always, because in this case, you see what they are doing. They are using g as a subjunctive infix. That's not really how Spanish operates, I think. I actually have the key here, so maybe Campbell is wrong. It could be hypercorrection, but it's not hypercorrection because in Spanish there's no g, right? In vaya there's no vaiga. In haya there's no haiga. So g is obviously a new development in these dialects, modeled on those words that have g, like traiga and kaiga in subjunctive. So g so what you would say, this is an example of analogical extension where g in forms like traiga and kaiga was interpreted as a subjunctive infix or subjunctive morpheme that applies to all subjunctive forms, whereas it only applies to several of them. So in these colloquial dialects, g is used consistently as subjunctive morpheme. That's extension. So you have a small number of g forms in standard Spanish, and then in all subjunctive forms you use this g, even in those where Spanish doesn't use g, like haya and vaya. Could be in a way hypercorrection, but because Spanish doesn't have this g generally, but I'm not an expert in Spanish, so you could be right. But based on Campbell, it's analogical extension. Now, you cannot always assume that it will be hypercorrection. The best, so this was very funny. You said hypercorrection, but because of the audio issues, I heard you said hypercorrection, I heard analogical extension. My daughter taught me another interesting one in her private school. This is what I'm paying for. So you say to somebody, tickle your ass with a feather. And when they say, what did you say? You then slowly say, particularly nasty weather. What did you hear? It's a good
That's
one.
hilarious.
Yeah, that's a good one, I think. Yeah, and now it's recorded. Oh my God. But okay, who cares? So we have just a couple of examples left, so we could actually end a couple of minutes earlier. I think there are only 6 more examples in this exercise. So Middle English had help present tense and help past tense. Modern English has help and helped for these. Now, this one should be relatively straightforward. So you have irregular forms that become regular.
Leveling.
Yes, this is analogical leveling. So in the written exam, what you would say, this is an example of analogical leveling. The irregular Middle English past tense form was reduced to a regular pattern of the ed suffix. And then if you're aiming for, let's say, higher grade, you can say analogical leveling in general reduces the number of allomorphs within a paradigm. But the key thing to mention is what I actually said first. In this is an analogical leveling. Here, the irregular verb help with the vowel alteration in the root to mark the past tense has been analogically leveled to regular verb pattern with a regular past tense suffix ed, something like that. You have to sound formal, right? You know that. You just have to use, what you can say in 2 words, you should say in 2 sentences, but that's the nature of expertise, let's say. Now, we have a different example, and this is English to emote. To emote as a verb, is derived from emotion, and infuse as a verb, to infuse, is derived from enthusiastic.
Back formation.
That is back formation, yes. And here you would say this is an example of back formation, and you can provide some additional examples if you want to, but here there's very little that you can say in terms of let's say explanation for what is happening. So you simply say this is yet another instance of a word having assumed to have a morphological composition that was not originally in the word. So
Should we include other examples?
uh, you can say this is similar to cherry and pea, but fundamentally for back formation there's very little to to explain, because this is simply about native speakers assuming a different morphological composition than the original one. But yeah, for extra credits, you know that you can always earn extra credits if you do one exercise really well and not another one not too well. The fact that you shined in the previous one can help you get more grades in the next one. So that's back formation. Many varieties of English have a new verb, and actually nowadays the whole English language has a verb to liaise based on liaison. That's again
Also back
back
formation.
formation. Yes, here in the exercise they are joined together, so examples of the same kind. But again, in the final exam, what you would write here is so this is an example of back formation, which is a analogical change, which is based on a reanalysis of the morphological structure along the pattern which was morphologically non-existent in the original verb, which is very common in borrowings, let's say. Uh, and these are all, of course, French words, so that's back formation. And we have just a couple of other examples. I think only two are remaining. So, and this is becoming repetitive. English to diagnose was derived from diagnosis. Again, right? Back formation. Thank you. And the last one from Campbell's book is from Finnish. Campbell has some weird fixation on the Finnish language. I tried to spare you from that, but Campbell's book on historical linguistics actually constantly gives some examples from Finnish. Finnish is cool, I think, as a language. It's really an interesting language to study. But since I'm not studying it, I find some of those examples, difficult to understand without spending a couple of minutes figuring out how Finnish works. But this is his question from Finnish. I have the key, so I will tell you the answer, but I'm not sure really how to how this works in Finnish. So Finnish rohtia, to dare, resulted from rohjeta, to be bold enough to dare, and tohtia, to dare. So I thought of many things, but what he says is that this is blending. Rohtia and comes from rohjeta and tohtia. So you take roh and from the first word and tia from the second word, and instead of rohjeta tohtia, you end up with rohtia. So this actually wraps up the exercises from Campbell's book on analogy itself. What I can, before we wrap up, I actually have additional slides. This is a very interesting topic in linguistics even today. Many linguists are analyzing how effective or productive these processes of analogical change are in different languages. So blending, for example, is very rare in Serbian, but in English it's one of the most common processes. Folk etymology seems to be equally represented in all languages. Back formation, usually in languages that borrow foreign words a lot, not in languages like Icelandic, where you don't really you know that Icelandic is one of the most conservative languages. They, for example, they don't have a word computer. They have their own word. There's a board of Icelandic linguists who create a new word when they see that there's a need for it. Uh, but the second one is constantly being discussed. How long does it take a word which has undergone an analogical process to become part of the vocabulary? In the old days, it took at least two generations for some really cool words, maybe a generation, so 25 to 50 years. What do you think is happening these days?
It happens much faster because of the internet and social networks.
Yes. So, for example, they say that the number of blends, new blends, especially in the domain of IT services or different cloud services related to social networks, but not always, communication, general blends and new words in communication, they are, they say that it takes under 5 years in some cases to for a word to be solidified and registered by dictionaries. And dictionary making from the old days was a very, slow moving process. These days it's turning into, like a journalistic activity where you every day you can theoretically find a new word, and then you have to follow it and decide whether it becomes a common word for all English varieties, or you will only add it to the British or to the English dictionary. Uh, what do you think? This is open for discussion, but I would just like your opinion. Which analogical changes are most productive in your native language? I gave you here some examples. So sirena, which I remember very well because I was a student in 1999 when we were bombarded by NATO, which led to some good outcomes, but it was not a pleasant experience to be bombarded. So most people didn't call sirena a sirena because it sounded like a mermaid. They know sirena mostly like, you know, a mermaid. So then very often people used svirena, that's folk etymology. Polyclinica, very often people call it poluklinika. I have many medical doctors in my closest and, let's say, a bigger family, and they tell me that this is very common among patients, that they keep pronouncing it as poluklinika, like, they do half a job there and then they send you to the institute for the operation. Then, for example, I also go regularly to Croatia, and there, I don't know if this is true also in Serbia, but if somebody is a combination of kreten and debil, you call that person a krembil. So that's blending. And I love that word, I don't know why. And of course, from advertisements, I have an example of Palmolive, which is not pronounced as Palmolive, but we pronounce it as Palmolive because marketing gurus think that this sounds more English than palm olive or Palmolive. Uh, so, do you have some other examples? What do you think? Do we have actually blending in Serbian? Hmm? There are some blends, but they are not so common. So you don't have to come up with examples right now. We can also discuss it later. In Serbian, actually, many people say of all these changes, the most common one is hypercorrection. So I have many examples here of hypercorrection. We have pravopis. Let me then wrap up with some generalizations among on analogy, and then we can. This will be exactly 8:15. So generalization number one. Some categories are more basic or unmarked than the others. So present tense is more basic than the past tense. Singular is more basic or more unmarked than plural. Indicative is unmarked in comparison to subjunctive and imperative. So the answer to those neo-grammarians who said, analogy is so terrible because you never know which word will be used as the basis for that A to B, C to X proportion, well, that's not entirely true. We know nowadays that those unmarked forms are generally the ones that are used as the basis for analogy. And then those unmarked ones are quite rare. When you do the analysis of analogical changes, you will see that unmarked ones are almost never the basis for analogy. Actually, the ones that are marked are the ones that will be changed through analogy. So another, complaint from neo-grammarians about analogy was that, uh, you know, it's not clear what it does. It just happens. You never know when it is going to happen. Well, it's not entirely true. We also know that there are certain patterns which we can use to predict whether analogy could uh, happen, and that's this generalization. Markers of grammatical categories should be as clear as possible. Analogy makes such markers longer, more overt, or more complex so that they are clear. That's why, for example, near, near, nearest was changed by analogy, because the original forms that developed from Old English, if you remember, nigh, near, and next, that made no sense. Near, near, nearest actually makes a lot of sense. And also, this is the reason why foreign plurals are constantly being replaced with the regular S for plurals. So you know that, for example, I don't know, virus was not originally viruses, it was viri, but since it's used so often, it's now viruses. The same thing is happening to cactus. So nobody really says cacti anymore because we have one in our room, probably most of us. I am looking actually at the cactus right now in my room. So cacti is dying out. So all these foreign plurals simply get the s suffix, and especially in those words such as cacti, this I is not really what you would consider a normal English suffix. So analogy makes suffixes clear. There's S, it's a consonant suffix. There should be no vowel suffixes, etc. Also, when neo-grammarians were complaining that analogy um, is unpredictable, it's not only that it makes grammatical markers clear, it also eliminates redundancy. So that's another thing that we know now about analogy. It will be in charge of eliminating redundancy. So analogy will eliminate redundancy, and this would actually create this nice system where one form equals one meaning. And the last generalization is something that you also notice from words such as near, near, nearest, and the original forms next and the nigh and the brother, brethren, and old, elder, eldest. So elder and eldest becoming specialized, and older, oldest becoming the normal ones. So this is a general rule in analogy, that a new form that is created via analogy will take over the basic meanings. If the earlier irregular form is maintained, it will only be used in specific context. Brother, brethren is a good example, but also this near and nigh. The end is nigh, so this original nigh form for near is retained only in religious context. So now it's time to say goodbye. And I don't know if you are actually aware, but goodbye is also analogy. This word is a perfect example of analogy, because goodbye comes from God be with you, like may the force be with you. So God be with you originally should have been God by, not goodbye, God by. Uh, but we don't have God by. Many phonological, experts, phonologists try to explain it with, some kind of a sound change, but there's no phonological change that can account for good in goodbye. Uh, so this is actually due to analogy with good morning, good afternoon, good night, and then instead of God by, goodbye. But fundamentally, it is God be with you. So whenever you say goodbye, you're actually being very religious, and you're saying that you wish that person to be constantly accompanied by the presence and care and comfort of God. What a note to end a lecture on. So don't forget that on Sunday evening at 11:59 and 59 seconds, the Google folder will stop accepting your uploads. So try to finish your family trees by then. Don't be concerned about semantic change. Don't look at the semantic change and worry too much about it. Just follow how the word changes its form in different languages. It's normal that the word will change its meaning as you move further away from Proto-Indo-European, and you will have one and the same root meaning quite different things in different languages, but you are following the development of the word, not necessarily the development of its meaning. So that's it. It's 8:18, so 3 minutes overtime, but I hope you'll forgive. If not, at least forget. And any questions, I can stop recording actually, and then you can maybe ask some questions that should not be recorded. Um, just a second. Where is that button? Yes.